I'm a little bit of an outsider to media studies. I'm an anthropologist and an ethnographer. So I'm not as familiar with the literature that you folks refer to, or the theories that you're sort of inclined to apply. My approach is ethnographic. I'm an ethnographer, and which is primarily really a methodology. What I do, and that word, I'll explain that a little bit because the word ethnography has come to mean a whole lot of different things in recent years. I do sort of old-fashioned classical anthropological ethnography, which means that I go to a place, a community of some sort, and spend a great deal of time there talking to people, both sometimes formally, including interviews and recorded interviews. Usually those tend to be very unstructured. But what I'm really seeking to do, and I will spend many months, and at times I've spent actually years in Nigeria getting sort of familiar with things on the ground, and I've studied the arts in Nigeria for 20 years, really beginning with music and dance, and over time finding myself drawn to the video industry, which sort of emerged during this time period that I was working in Nigeria. What I do is stay there long enough that I begin to get a sense of the discourse on the ground about whatever it is that I'm trying to study. In this case, the film industry. It's a very easy thing to do in Nigeria because Nigerians tend to be a very outspoken people. It's not hard to get them to express their opinions about things, and the movie industry especially seems to generate lots of things for people to say. So over time I get a sense of that discourse on the ground. And then I take that and I use it as a heuristic to kind of critically examine the things that we assume and think about Africa. So it's a matter of sort of using an indigenous point of view as a critical test of some of the assumptions that we have and the theories that we use. And we have a couple of theories on the table here. The most prominent one, of course, this notion of civil society. Last night, there was also a sort of strong call to not to forget political economy, which I was sort of glad was raised because well, as you can see, I don't have a PowerPoint. Usually I stand up and I have a PowerPoint studded with movie clips, and I show all these great little Nollywood movies are a lot easier to watch in short clips than to sit through the whole thing. So, but you know, I can pick like a trailer. I can pick the little bits of action that really illustrate the points I want to make, and it makes for a great presentation. But I'm not going to talk about the contents of movies at all today. I'm going to talk about economics. So that's why I was so delighted that that was sort of put on the table as an important thing. Well, both political economy and civil society are sort of old chestnuts, well worn from the Enlightenment philosophers. And that presents some interesting challenges. I'll just cut to the chase and let you know that in terms of political economy, I really come down with a thumbs up on that. We have to sort of put the politics back in economics. I guess most of you know that in the 19th century, political economy was a discipline. Karl Marx was a scholar who worked within the discipline of political economy. In the 20th century, the discipline of economics decided to not talk about politics. And as far as I can see, they really, at least in the United States, they've avoided it a lot, whereas political economy became somehow a subset of Marxism, sort of a switch of the organizational structure altogether. But I agree that we need to bring the politics back into economics if we're ever going to be able to make sense out of what's going on in Africa, including the film industry, maybe even especially the film industry. But the notion of civil society, little more problematic. And the fact that the notion of civil society has been of limited use in African studies is not particularly new. There was a paper written in 2001 by David Lewis called Civil Society in Non-Western Contexts, Reflections on the Usefulness of a Concept, which I actually, again, like I say, because I'm not familiar with the literature, I don't know how important that particular article is in your literature, if it's something you've never heard of, but it certainly was useful to me in sorting it out. And Lewis makes the rather obvious point that the notion of civil society applies better in some places than it does in other places. And I certainly get the impression that those people who use the concept of civil society have by now accepted the idea that it has to be adapted to local circumstances because societies organize themselves in very different ways. But even with this, accepting this modification, that this is an idea that is sort of soft, that needs to be molded to conditions on the ground. When you have an idea that has a soft definition, then it begins to disappear if you don't have some sort of bounds to it. And so you have to harden those negative aspects of the definition. And actually civil society, that works well for civil society because it's almost always defined negatively in terms of what it isn't. It's not government, it's not the market. That gives us some sense of its boundaries. Well, this then kind of falls apart when you get to Nigeria. Because when you have a kleptocracy, this rather unusual arrangement that is fairly more common than we would like in Africa, you get a very different situation. I was struck listening to last night to Lisa talk about the different kinds of political arrangements in Burma and then moving to the Philippines. And in Nigeria, you don't have a repressive government like you have in Burma that's exercising a lot of censorship. Because in a kleptocracy, the government doesn't bother doing things like that. In a kleptocracy, the government is not particularly concerned with the civilian population, and as long as they're not out rioting in the streets, they would prefer to ignore them. They don't really care that much what kinds of movies they're watching or anything else. And that really, the reasons for that are economic. Nigeria has a very lopsided economy. 80% of all government revenues come from petroleum. The petroleum industry extracts billions from Nigeria, but it's not what economists call a value-added industry. In other words, the value of Nigerian labor is not added. The petroleum just comes out raw. Nigerian labor contributes nothing to the value of the oil, and the oil contributes nothing to Nigeria. The kleptocracy really, if you go back and look at it historically, is quite clearly both a sort of artifact of the colonial arrangements of extracting resources that existed prior to 1960 under British rule. And also, on the other hand, it's very much a historical product of arrangements between the multinational oil corporations and a cadre of powerful thugs, sometimes referred to as the Kaduna Mafia, that's been in power on and off in Nigeria ever since independence. So when we say not government, in Nigeria, you would be hard-pressed to find anything that you could say, that's government. Government's hard to find in Nigeria. Anyone who actually lives there will tell you you don't really hear much from them. And Nigerians mostly complain about they wish their government would do something like, fix the roads or perhaps make sure that the electricity was on more than 2 hours a day. The other one, not market. Well, again, huge problem, because it turns out that thing that we refer to as the market actually is, again, inaccessible to Nigerians. Most of them really don't participate in that market that is the part of global capitalism that extends into Nigeria. Most Nigerians live and work, and all their property is within something called we refer to as the informal economy. Now, as an anthropologist, I was sort of aware of this as I went into this study, but I really was not. I was a student of the arts, remember, not an economist. I went to economics thinking, well, let me see what economists have to say about this unformalized part of the world's economy, which it didn't take much reading for me to realize that the vast majority of the world's population lives almost entirely, and all of their economic transactions take place entirely within this informal economy. And I found out that economists simply didn't have anything to say about it. It turns out that economists get all their data from government records and corporate records. And data collection is not a question that is raised. Data is taken for granted, and all the sort of debates, the academic issues are over the methodologies used to crunch those, and whether you're looking at macro systems or microsystems and everything else. But underlying it all is the assumption that we take that aspect that has been formalized. Of course, it's hard to count things that aren't formalized. Formalization is simply keeping the records. What the formal economy is, really, is the extent to which the bureaucracies of the world have reached their tentacles into the economic interactions of individuals. Wow. I was going to give you some ethnography here, and I haven't gotten to it yet. So I might want to cut ahead. But the point is, I think the important point to understand about the informal economy, I've sort of, in talking about Nollywood, I've run up against a certain assumption in many disciplines that commercial media are within a sort of capitalist frame, and that immediately following that is a whole set of assumptions about the intentions and how that works and what drives it, et cetera. And lurking at the center of all this is the momentum of capital. Well, there is no capital in the informal economy. Capital is, in fact, a product of formalization. It's only when you have a title to your land that you can transform that property into capital. That's what Hernando de Soto, the one economist that I found in the world, a Peruvian economist who has actually written extensively about the informal economy. De Soto argues that the poor of the world are actually extremely wealthy. He even, well, not extremely, but wealthy enough that they, if they could realize the capital potential of the property that they actually own, then many of the problems that they have would be eliminated. It's a radical idea. It irritates a whole lot of people. But he's actually making a good point, that the vast majority of the world's wealth is unrecorded, and therefore those people who own it are relegated to the fringes. They are essentially excluded from the economy that the rest of us participate in. This becomes really obvious in a place like Africa, where that dividing line is as hard as it and impassable as it is. Now, what I wanted, the argument that I want to make, and I am going to try to give you a little bit of ethnography here to take you to Nollywood descriptively. I'm going to basically say that in at least the Nigerian context, Nollywood is civil society, at least that it is performing many of the functions that we, particularly positive functions, going with this sort of idea that there is good and bad civil society, some of the better functions that civil society serves. And I'm going to read you just a little bit of descriptive ethnography from my experiences watching a Nigerian movie being made. And we'll start at the auditions. We were at a hotel in Enugu. I'd been asked to come and observe the making of a film. It was called Ebube. And when I arrived, they were doing auditions, they were casting. There were hundreds of people around an outdoor pavilion. Some of them walking with an air of celebrity. There was some very glamorous women there dressed in the latest Nigerian designs, and Nigeria also has a robust fashion industry. Most of the people there, though, looked more like the average struggling Nigerian. Many of them dressed in the kind of trickle-down mission clothes, American T-shirts, etc. That are 2 minutes, okay. In any case, I have some wonderful images of hungry people looking at the rice they're feeding to the birds in the hotel, etc. But let me just dispense with all this, since we don't have enough time for ethnography here. I think what I saw happening was I saw the producer go to the village and negotiate with the village that they were going to use for the setting, because they had to create a 19th century village for the purposes of the film. He went there and negotiated with the elders of the village to do that. The exchange was that the movie production team paved the road into the village from the highway, which was several miles, and something that we normally would think of, well, that government would do that, right? Not in Nigeria, no. So the road is paved. There are agreements made to provide jobs for locals there are many areas that require unskilled labor. The shoot was large. There were several hundred people there doing all kinds of things. It's amazing to watch. It's hard to convey the kind of festive spirit around one of these Nollywood shoots. You've got costumers with treadle sewing machines just working furiously and costuming people right on the spot, and the makeup artists working on them and braiding hair and trying to recreate a 19th century look. But the industry it's not organized with there are no big studios, there are no vertically structured organizations at all. It's amazingly decentralized. When a producer simply tries to get one of the marketers to put forward $10,000 or so, which is 10, 15 is all it takes, to make a movie, they go out, they rent all the equipment. They own nothing. There is no sort of capital base here. Every time they make a movie, they rent the equipment, they hire the people, they get a site, it comes together. It's like one of those annual festivals. Suddenly it occurs, it happens, and then it's gone. 2 weeks later, it just simply disappears, only to show up somewhere else producing some other movie for some other. But there are really no big corporations involved in this at all. And Nollywood really grew up out of a folk exchange in homemade videos. And slowly, really driven purely by the absolute hunger that Africans had for movies about them. They were so sick of watching Schwarzenegger and Bollywood romances. I mean, they enjoy those things, but it's not them. to be able to find media that tells stories about, co-wives doing witchcraft against each other. Wow, now that, that's just like the stories they were hearing from their cousin. It's all familiar. And on the basis of that alone, it has basically taken over the African mediascape, and I'm out of time. So I'm sure that the things that I didn't get to say in here will be exactly the things that I will have to say when you ask me questions about it. So thank you.